She was 20 years old, and she had $1 to her name, and on the morning this story begins, she used it to buy a building that everyone in the town of Cold Harbor believed was haunted. Her name was Esther Vane, and the building was the old commercial Icehouse down by the frozen lake, a great windowless barn of a place, double-walled and packed with sawdust, that had stored the winter ice of Cold Harbor for the summers of a vanished age, and had stood locked and shunned for 80 years. And the reason the people of Cold Harbor believed it was haunted was that at the bottom of it, deep in the great block of ice that had never fully melted in all those 80 years, there was something. A shape. A dark shape frozen in the heart of the ice that a body could just make out if they dared open the door and climb down and look, and that had not moved, not shifted, not changed in the memory of anyone living. They called it the Frozen Man, for that was the shape of it, or seemed to be. Down in the blue heart of the old ice, 80 years deep, was the shape of a man, and no one in Cold Harbor had ever been willing to dig him out, because a town that has a frozen man in its icehouse would rather tell stories about him than chip him free and learn who he was, and because there was a fear on the place, an old inherited dread that had kept the icehouse door shut for 4 generations. Children dared each other to run and touch its wall and run away. That was the whole of anyone's courage toward the Cold Harbor Icehouse, and now a thrown-out girl with $1 had bought it. To understand why she did it, you have to understand what had been done to her and to her mother's family before her, and for that you have to go back. Esther Vane had grown up in Cold Harbor, but poor, on the wrong side of a wrong that had been done to her family 3 generations back and had shaped every hard year since. She was the great-granddaughter of a man named Tobias Vane, who had in the old days been the owner of the Cold Harbor Icehouse and the ice trade that was the making of the town. For Cold Harbor had been an ice town once. Before the days of the mechanical ice machine, whole cities of the warm South had been kept cool through their long summers by ice cut from the frozen lakes of the North and shipped down by rail packed in sawdust, and Cold Harbor's lake had frozen thick and clear and pure, and Tobias Vane had built the great ice house and the ice trade, and had made the town prosperous, and had made himself, for a time, a wealthy man. And then, 80 years before this story begins, in a single winter Tobias Vane had lost everything. He had lost his fortune, and his ice house, and his good name, and his family had gone from the first house in Cold Harbor to the poorest, and had stayed poor ever since. And the way it had happened was the wound that Esther Vane had grown up inside of, and it was a wound with a lie at the center of it. The ice trade, in its day, had been a marvel, and Esther had grown up hearing of it the way children hear of a golden age their family once ruled and lost. In the deep of each northern winter, when the lake froze thick and clear, the whole town had gone out onto the ice with saws and horses and long iron bars, and cut the frozen lake into great uniform blocks, and hauled them up the ramps into the icehouse, and packed them in sawdust that kept them from melting through the long warm months. And all summer the ice had gone south by the railcar load to the cities that had no cold of their own to keep their food and their sick rooms and their fine hotels, and the money had come back north, and Cold Harbor had grown rich on winter itself, on the one thing the poor North had that the rich South could not make: cold. Tobias Vane had built it all. He had seen, before other men, that a frozen lake was a fortune if a man had the wit to store it, and he had built the great double-walled icehouse, and organized the cutting, and struck the rail contracts. And for a while the Vane name had meant, in Cold Harbor, everything good that a name could mean. The story that Cold Harbor told, the story that had come down for 80 years, was that Tobias Vane had been a thief and worse. It was said that his partner in the ice trade, a man named Aldous Crane, had vanished in the winter the trade collapsed, and that Tobias Vane had been suspected of murdering him, for the two had quarreled bitterly over money. And Aldous Crane was never seen again, and the ice business failed in scandal and suspicion, and Tobias Vane died a few years later, a broken and disgraced man, never charged, for there was no body and no proof. but never cleared either, for there was no body to clear him. And the Crane family, meanwhile, had risen. Aldous Crane's brother, Silas, had taken over what was left of the ice trade and the lakefront lands, and had rebuilt a fortune, and the Cranes had been the first family of Cold Harbor for 80 years, while the Vanes had been its poorest, and the shadow of the vanished man and the suspected murder had hung over the Vane name for 4 generations, so that even Esther, who had done nothing, was a Vane, and in Cold Harbor to be a Vane was to be the descendant of a man who had likely killed his partner and gotten away with it. Esther had been raised on the other side of that story. Her mother and her grandmother before her had held to a different account, passed down in whispers within the family, that Tobias Vane had been no murderer, that he had been ruined and framed, that the truth of what happened to Aldous Crane had died with the men who knew it. But it was only a family's word against a town's belief, and a family's word, especially a poor and disgraced family's word, weighs nothing against a story a town has decided to believe. Esther's mother had died when Esther was 17, worn out with poverty and the long weight of the name, and Esther had gone to live with a distant connection, and when that connection's husband threw her out. The week this story begins, over a quarrel about the cost of her keep, she found herself 20 years old and alone in Cold Harbor, with $1 and the name of a suspected murderer. And it was then, thrown out, with nothing left to lose and nothing left to protect, that Esther Vane did the thing no Vane in 80 years had dared to do. She went to the town clerk and she asked to buy the old Icehouse. "Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Esther Vane," and the Icehouse no one would enter, and the shape frozen 80 years in the heart of the ice. And if a story of an old lie and a patient truth is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what part of this wide country you are watching from. We are always glad of the company here in the dark. The town clerk had thought she was mad. The Icehouse had reverted to the town for taxes 2 generations back, and had sat on the books as a worthless and unsellable lot ever since, a haunted ruin no one would touch. And when Esther Vane laid her $1 on the counter and asked to buy it, the clerk sold it to her for the dollar mostly to be rid of a thing that had embarrassed the town's ledgers for 50 years, and partly, it must be said, out of a mean small-town pleasure in seeing a Vane go to live in the haunted house of her disgraced ancestor. Word went round Cold Harbor by nightfall. The Vane girl had bought the frozen man. The Cranes, in their fine house on the hill, heard of it, and if there was unease among them, no one outside the family saw it, not yet. But Esther Vane had not bought the Icehouse out of madness, or desperation, or even out of the faint hope of shelter, though she needed shelter badly. She had bought it because of a thing her mother had told her, once, near the end, a thing that was the true inheritance of the Vane family. More than the disgrace, more than the poverty. Her mother had told her that Tobias Vane, in his last years, broken and disgraced, had said again and again to his children a strange thing that they had taken for the raving of a ruined mind, but that had been passed down anyway, because a dying man's words are kept even when they are not understood. He had said, "The truth is in the ice. The truth is in the ice, and it will keep until someone is brave enough to go down and find it." For 4 generations the Vanes had taken those words for madness or metaphor, the ramblings of a man destroyed. But Esther Vane, standing thrown out and ruined at the lowest point of her family's long, low story, had understood them suddenly and completely, the way you understand a thing when you have finally been brought low enough to see it plain. The truth is in the ice, and there was, frozen in the heart of the old Icehouse, a shape that the whole town called the Frozen Man, and had been too afraid to dig out for 80 years. What if it was not a story? What if it was exactly, literally, what her great-grandfather had said it was? What if the truth of what happened to Aldous Crane had been down in that ice the whole time, kept perfect and unchanged by the cold, waiting 80 years for a Vane brave enough or ruined enough to go down and bring it up? She had $1 and no proof, and only a dying man's words. But she had, that morning, bought the ice. The work of it was slow and cold and lonely, and Esther Vane did most of it alone, for there was no one in Cold Harbor who would help a Vane dig out the frozen man, and she had no money to hire help, even had anyone been willing. She moved into the icehouse itself, into the old foreman's room built into its outer wall, and she made herself a life at the edge of survival, taking in washing and mending from the few in town, not too proud to give work to a Vane. And every day she went down into the great, cold, dim heart of the icehouse and worked at the ice. It was a strange place to spend a winter and a spring. The icehouse had been built to keep ice through the summers, double-walled, packed with sawdust 2 feet thick in the walls and floor and ceiling, windowless and insulated so well that even after 80 years, even with its ice-cutting days long over, the great core of ancient ice at its bottom had never fully melted. It had shrunk, over the generations, from the towering blocks that had once filled the building to a single great mass perhaps 10 feet deep at the lowest point of the floor, blue-white and hard as stone and clouded with 80 years of trapped air and sawdust and time. And deep in that mass, when Esther brought her lantern down close and looked, was the shape. The frozen man, dark and man-sized and still. The cold of the place was not the sharp, clean cold of outdoors, but a heavy, still, ancient cold that seemed to come up out of the ice itself and settle into a person's bones and stay there. Esther learned to work in every garment she owned at once, and still to feel it. Her breath hung white in the lantern light. Her fingers went stiff and clumsy at the chisel, and she had to stop often and hold them against her body to bring the feeling back. The sawdust of 80 years was everywhere, in the walls and underfoot and drifting in the still air, and it got into her clothes and her hair and her food, and the smell of it, damp wood and old cold, and something older underneath, was the smell of all those months. And it was quiet in the way that only a windowless, insulated place is quiet, a deep, dead silence in which she could hear her own heart and her own chisel, and nothing else at all. No wind, no town, no world, only Esther Vane, and the ice, and the shape in the ice. She did not simply hack at it. Esther Vane was a careful person, made careful by a life in which carelessness was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and she understood that if there was truth in the ice, then the ice must be worked as carefully as evidence, and not smashed like a thing to be got through. So she worked it the slow way, the way ice is properly worked, with saw and chisel and warm water poured in patient trickles, cutting down toward the shape a hand's breadth at a time, clearing the clouded ice away layer by layer, week by week, through the last of the winter and into the spring, drawing nearer and nearer to the thing that 80 years had kept. She kept a lamp of warm water going, melting snow she carried in, and she learned that warm water poured slow and steady did in an hour what a chisel could not do in a day, freeing the ice's grip without shattering what it held, and she learned the patience of the thaw, which is the slowest patience there is, for ice gives up nothing to hurry and everything to time. And there were nights, alone in the cold with the lantern and the slowly emerging shape, when Esther Vane was afraid, for she did not know what she would find, and the town's dread was an old strong thing, and it worked on her in the dark. The lantern threw great shifting shadows on the sawdust walls, and the shape in the ice seemed, in the flickering, to move, though it never had in 80 years, and never would. And more than once she climbed back up out of the deep of the icehouse with her heart pounding, and stood in the doorway breathing the clean night air until the fear let go of her. But she always went back down. She thought of her mother, worn out with the weight of a name she had done nothing to earn, buried poor under a lie. She thought of her great-grandfather saying the truth is in the ice to children who thought him mad, and dying with no one believing him. And she kept working, because she had understood that the only way out from under an 80-year-old lie was straight down through the ice that held the truth of it, and that no one else in 4 generations had been willing to go. and that if she climbed out now and did not come back, the lie would simply win, as it had always won, and Yvain would once again have looked at the truth and turned away afraid. She would not be the fourth to do it. She took up her chisel and her warm water, and she went back down into the cold. In the last week, as she cleared the final clouded layers, the shape came clear, and Esther Vane saw that it was, indeed, a man. A man frozen in the ice, perfectly preserved by 80 years of cold, a man in the clothes of the old ice trade days, and she knew before she had fully freed him, with a certainty that came up through her like cold water, who he had to be. It was Aldous Crane, the vanished partner. The man Tobias Vane had been suspected for 80 years of murdering. He had been in the ice the whole time. She sat down beside the emerging face of him, there in the deep cold with her lantern, and she was quiet a long while. She had come down through the ice looking for a truth, and here it was, a real man, a real face, 80 years dead and yet not decayed at all, held so perfectly by the cold that he might have drowned yesterday. There was no horror in it, though she had braced for horror. There was only a great sadness, and a great stillness, and the strange intimacy of being the first living soul in 80 years to look on a lost man's face. Whatever this man had been, whatever the town had made of him, he had been a person once, with a life and a death of his own. And he had been down here in the dark and the cold the whole time the world above had told its story about him. Esther Vane, who knew what it was to have a story told about you that was not yours, felt something like kinship with the frozen man, and she reached out and cleared the last of the ice from his face with her bare and aching hand, gently the way you would wake someone you loved. But it was not what he was that mattered. It was how he had come to be there, and that, too, the ice had kept. For when Esther Vane at last freed the frozen man from the ice, working with a care that was near to reverence, she found the truth her great-grandfather had promised, frozen with him, kept perfect for 80 years. Aldous Crane had not been murdered. Frozen in the ice in his stiff dead hand, held fast against his chest as a drowning man holds the last thing he grasped, was a leather document wallet, and the ice had preserved it and its contents as perfectly as it had preserved the man, and when Esther thawed it with the same patient care she had thawed everything, she found inside it the papers that told the whole true story. Papers that Aldous Crane had died holding, and that had lain in his frozen hand at the bottom of the Icehouse for 80 years. Aldous Crane had drowned. He had fallen through the ice of the lake in the deep of that long-ago winter, at night, alone, and the current under the ice had carried his body, and it had come, by the intake channel that fed lake water to the Icehouse for the cutting, into the Icehouse's own flooded lower chamber, and there, in the flooding and freezing of that hard winter, it had been sealed into the forming ice, and no one had ever known, for no one dug into the working ice, and by spring he was 10 feet deep in a season's harvest and beyond any finding. An accident. A man alone on bad ice at night, and the lake took him, and the Icehouse kept him. There had been no murder at all. But the papers in his frozen hand told more, and it was the more that mattered. For Aldous Crane, the night he died, had been fleeing. The documents were his own confession and his own evidence, gathered and carried in his own hand, for Aldous Crane had discovered that his brother Silas had been robbing the ice trade blind, embezzling the profits, cooking the books, and ruining the business from within, while it was made to look as though Tobias Vane, the honest partner, were the one bleeding it dry. Aldous Crane had found the proof of his own brother's crime, and had meant, that night, to bring it to Tobias Vane, to make it right, to clear the honest man he had let his brother frame. And on his way across the frozen lake in the dark, carrying the truth to the man it would save, Aldous Crane had gone through the ice and drowned, and the truth had drowned with him, and sunk into the Icehouse, and frozen, and waited 80 years. Esther read the papers over and over by her lantern, there in the cold beside the man who had carried them, and the whole shape of the 80-year lie came clear to her, page by page. There were the false ledger entries in Silas Crane's hand, copied out by Aldous as evidence, showing where the ice trade's profits had truly gone. There was a letter, half-finished, that Aldous had been writing to Tobias Vane, that began with an apology, for Aldous had known his brother was letting Tobias take the blame for the failing trade, and had said nothing too long out of family loyalty, and had at last found he could not live with it. And there was Aldous Crane's own signed statement of what his brother had done, dated the very day he died, meant to be sworn before the law. He had gathered it all, and written it all, and set out across the night ice to give an honest man back his name, and the lake had taken him one crossing short of it. It was the saddest thing Esther Vane had ever read, and the truest, and it cleared her family entire. And Silas Crane, when his brother vanished, had seen his chance and taken it, and had let it be believed that Tobias Vane had murdered Aldous over their quarrel, which turned the suspicion of the ice trade's ruin away from the true thief and onto the honest man, and had ruined Tobias Vane completely, and had built upon that ruin the Crane fortune that had made his family the first of Cold Harbor. For 80 years, the whole long wrong of the Vane family, 4 generations of poverty and disgrace, had been built on an accident that Silas Crane had turned into a murder to hide a theft, and the proof of all of it had lain frozen in a dead man's hand at the bottom of the Icehouse the entire time, exactly where Tobias Vane, who must have half guessed the truth, had told his children it would be. The truth is in the ice. What followed came slowly, the way the thaw itself comes, and Esther Vane went about it with the same patience she had brought to the ice. She did not run into the streets of Cold Harbor with her frozen man and her thawed papers, for she was a Vane, and a Vane's word was worth nothing in Cold Harbor, and she knew that a story 80 years believed does not fall to a poor girl's shouting. She went instead to the county seat, and to the law beyond Cold Harbor's reach, and she brought the frozen body, packed in its own ancient ice, and the preserved documents, to men whose business was truth, and who owed nothing to the Cranes. And the body was examined, and the papers were studied, and their age and their hand confirmed, and the account they told was checked against the old records of the ice trade's failure, and it all held, every part of it, because a true thing held in ice for 80 years is still a true thing when it comes out. The Cranes fought it, of course. The Crane family of that day, the great-grandchildren of Silas, were the first family of the county and had lawyers and standing and every reason to want the ice to keep its secret forever. They called it a fraud, and a Vane's desperate invention, and they hired men to say the documents were forged and the body was a stranger's. And for a while the old machinery of Crane influence turned against Esther Vane, as it had turned against her family for 80 years. But there is no arguing with a frozen man who has been holding the truth in his hand for 80 years. The documents were Aldous Crane's own, in his own proven hand, checked against letters and ledgers of his that still survived in the town's old records. And no forger could have aged paper 80 years, nor imitated a dead man's private hand across a wallet full of pages. The manner of his death, drowned and frozen and carried into the Icehouse by the lake's own current through the very intake channel the cutters had used, was an accident that no honest examiner could pin on any murderer's hand. And the more the Cranes fought, the worse it looked for them. For a family that spends a fortune to keep an old truth frozen is a family that has understood what the truth will cost it. Tobias Vane was cleared. 80 years too late for him to know it, the man who had died disgraced was made honest again. His murder suspicion dissolved. His ruin shown to be the work of the very family that had prospered by it. The town of Cold Harbor, which had told the story of the murdering Vane for 4 generations, had to unlearn it all at once, and a town does not enjoy learning that its settled certainties were a rich family's lie. But the frozen man left it no choice, and the wrong done to the Vanes was unwound as far as the law could unwind an 80-year-old wrong. The Crane fortune, shown to be founded on a theft and a lie, came apart in the courts over the following years, and restitution was made, as much as could be made across so many years, to the Vane family, which was now only Esther, She, who had been thrown out with $1, became the heir at last to the honesty of her great-grandfather, and to a good part of the fortune that had been stolen from him, and the name of Vane, which had meant murderer in Cold Harbor for 80 years, came to mean, instead, the honest family that a thief had ruined and that a brave girl had cleared. Esther Vane did not gloat, and she did not flee Cold Harbor, and she did not tear down the Icehouse. She did a gentler and a wiser thing. Aldous Crane, the frozen man who had died carrying the truth to save an honest partner, she saw buried properly at last, in the Cold Harbor churchyard, with a stone that told the truth of him, that he had died trying to right a wrong, and had kept the proof of it faithfully for 80 years in the cold, and that the town owed him not fear, but honor. For Aldous Crane, in the end, was no ghost and no horror. He was a good man who had drowned doing a brave thing, and the truth he carried had cleared the Vanes at last, and Esther Vane would not let him be remembered as the frozen man a moment longer than she could help. She stood at his burying, near the only mourner he had after 80 years, and she thought that it was a strange thing to grieve a man dead 4 generations, and yet she did grieve him. For he had given her back her family's name with his last brave act, and had waited faithfully in the ice through all the long years until she came, and there is no truer friend than that, though they had never met and never could. She restored the Icehouse, not to its old trade, for the world made its ice by machine now, and the ice trade was 80 years dead. But she cleared it, and mended it, and made of it a place of record, where the whole true story was kept, the documents and the account of the ice trade and the wrong and its righting, so that Cold Harbor could never again forget the truth it had been too afraid to dig out. And she lived a long life in the town that had scorned her name, respected now and unhurried, and free at last of the 80-year weight her mother and her grandmother had carried to their graves. She had been 20 years old, and thrown out and down to a single silver dollar, and she had spent it on a haunted icehouse that a whole town swore held nothing but a frozen horror. It was the best dollar she ever spent. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the fortune restored, though that was just. It is that some truths are kept for us by patience itself, held safe and unchanged through the long years by something outside of any human hand, waiting only for a person brave enough to go down and bring them up into the light. The truth of the Vane family lay frozen in that ice for 80 years. Perfect, unmelted, exactly as it had been the night a good man drowned carrying it. It did not rot, and it did not fade, and it did not lose one particle of its truth, though 4 generations lived and died believing the lie that stood in its place. It only waited, in the cold and the dark, for Esther Vane to be brought low enough and made brave enough to dig. What lie in your own family's past might dissolve entirely, if someone had the courage to go down through the ice and see what has been kept there all along? So we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. Is there a story your family has carried a long time, a disgrace or a doubt, that you have always suspected the truth of was frozen somewhere still, waiting to be found? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.